I think we'll begin. I'm Lynn Carey Mayta, and I'm a trustee of the library right now, following in my Uncle Henry Cooper's footsteps, and this lecture series is named after him. A year ago, we had our first speaker in the Henry S. F. Cooper Jr. lecture series in early American history and literature, who was appropriately Wayne Franklin, who just finished his biography of James Fenimore Cooper, one of the many authors who've used this library. This year, equally appropriately, we have Erica Dunbar and her new book, Never Caught, the Washington's Relentless Pursuit of Their Runaway Slave, Ona Judge. And this book and the library have something in common. As is well known, Washington took 2 books out of the library in 1789 and never returned them. Ona Judge likewise escaped and never came back. Escaping slavery was no joke. As Horace Greeley said in a letter written at the time of the Civil War, those who have thus escaped have been brutally and madly repulsed and often surrendered to be scourged, maimed, and tortured by the ruffian traitors who pretend to own them. That's an end quote. And even those who earned or were given freedom suffered terribly. Think of Phyllis Wheatley, who was a subtle and daring poet during the Revolution, addressed a poem to George Washington, but in post-revolutionary Boston died free, poor, and forgotten. In reading Erica Dunbar's book, a finalist for the National Book Award for Nonfiction, you can see that the president, as his name is signed on the library's register, lived around the corner from the library's quarters, which at that time were in the Federal Building on Wall Street, facing Broad Street, when it served for a brief period as the Library of Congress. That honor was transferred to the Library Company of Philadelphia when the government, with the Washington family, moved there in 1790, and where Erica served as the inaugural director of the program in African American history. Erica Dunbar needs little introduction. She is the Charles and Mary Beard Professor of History at Rutgers University. Her first book, A Fragile Freedom, African American Women and Emancipation in the Antebellum City, was published by Yale University Press in 2008. She received her BA in History and African American Studies from the University of Pennsylvania, in the city where she was born, and went on to get an MA and PhD from Columbia University more or less at the same time I did, so we have that in common. She has been the recipient of Ford, Mellon, and SSRC fellowships, and is an Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lecturer. She's committed herself to, and this is from your website, but telling the stories of Black women who lived, loved, struggled, worked, prayed, and fought to survive in a nation that still recognized many of them as property, end quote. We are delighted to welcome Erica Dunbar to the New York Society Library.
Thank you. That was such a nice introduction, and there are all these sort of points of contact when you mentioned how George Washington borrowed books. I laughed because I think about the moments where students borrow books and don't return them. But I immediately thought, I wonder if Ona had seen those books. I wonder where he placed those books in the house. I wonder if she saw them. I wonder if she wondered what they said. So I had the opportunity a couple of months ago. I was down in Philadelphia, where I live. I was down at the new Museum of the American Revolution, and I'm going to have an event there in the spring. And so they brought me in, and they were so excited to show me this artifact they had down in the vault. And I said, okay. So they brought it out, and it was a doorknob that was on George Washington's door, like an interior doorknob on his bedroom. And I'm like, here, this was on the door, probably to his bedroom. And it was the first time that I was able to actually touch something that I'm certain Ona touched, right? And as someone who does biography, as well as someone who focuses on the lives of enslaved women, that was really powerful and really sort of touching. So I asked him if I could come back and hold the doorknob again, whenever I want. So I'll be back. Thank you for having me and for giving me a chance to talk a little bit about Ona, about the book, about the work that I do. So tonight I'll talk about the book. I'll also read a little bit from the book for those of you who haven't read it. To sort of, I think it's different when you hear the actual author read the book, just to kind of give you a feeling for my writing. So 41 years ago in January, ABC, the American Broadcasting Company, made history. My generation, and those older than I, remember the broadcast television miniseries called Roots, the saga of an American family based on Alex Haley's novel. Roots aired in 1977 and was seen by over 100 million viewers. It was one of the most watched television broadcasts, and it won 9 Emmy Awards. Most of Black Hollywood was in Roots. And for families such as mine, the miniseries really became this sort of broadcast event. I was in first grade when Roots aired, so I've just told you how old I am. Figure it out. My parents believed that my sister and I, although in first grade, should watch every night of the miniseries. And it was like 8 nights. It was a long time, right? And for a first grader, that was a lot of television to watch repeatedly. I remember my sister and I carefully spreading our Raggedy Ann blankets on the floor and prepared to watch ABC's presentation. As a family, we watched a young Kunta Kinte endure kidnappings and beatings, the degradation of the auction block. Viewers were introduced to characters who, although trapped in the unimaginable violence of American slavery, managed to find and maintain dignity. It wasn't until I was much older that I understood the importance of Roots to many American families, especially Black families. My parents and most of Black America wanted desperately to climb out of what we saw as television's Black history famine. And shortly after its premiere, Roots was plagued with controversy. Controversy regarding the authenticity of Haley's research and the scholarship. But families like mine held fast to the importance of the miniseries. Many criticized what they saw as sort of romanticized relationships that appeared in Roots. But it didn't really matter to us. We were grateful. Grateful to see our history find its way to prime time. Grateful that the stories of the enslaved were available now to a large audience. And really it's at this moment that Kunta Kinte becomes a kind of household name. I had no idea that this moment in 1977 would help to shape my professional trajectory. When I think about what prompted me to become a writer and a historian, I think about the power of Roots. And eventually it would help sort of define my passion for writing the histories of the enslaved and for delivering history to a larger public, to write what Never Caught is, which is a general audience book. And I'll sort of talk in a bit about shifting between writing academic texts versus one that is more well suited for a larger audience. About 15, 16 years ago, I was completing some research for my first book, which was A Fragile Freedom. So my area of interest really focuses on how enslaved people, enslaved women in the North became free. I went to graduate school thinking, all right, I'm going to go to Columbia and I'm going to work with Eric Foner, who is the most well-known historian in Reconstruction history. I'm going to write Reconstruction history. And then I got to Columbia and I was like, I don't want to write Reconstruction history. I want to change my mind. And Eric Foner was great. He was like, yeah, sure, do what you want to do. I'll support you. And I sort of made this decision. I couldn't really understand what was happening during the Civil War, during this period after the Civil War known as Reconstruction, without knowing what happened before it. And I was sort of stunned by the lack of materials written about slavery in the North, as if it were just a Southern phenomenon. And I thought, okay, well, Massachusetts was the first colony to legalize slavery. Why do we know so much about slavery in Virginia? You know, like, where are these other stories? All of the colonies had African slavery. Where are these texts? And so it was at that moment I decided I wanted to write a focus on the North. So I was doing what kind of nerdy historians do when they're working on a book. I was trying to figure out everyday life in Philadelphia, the end of the 18th century. So what do? We look at the newspaper, right? That's how you sort of figure out everyday life. So I'm in the microfilm room at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, looking through a newspaper called the Philadelphia Gazette. And I just kind of wanted to get an idea, what was the cost for a barrel of cider at that moment? What goods were being advertised? And what else was happening politically? So I'm reading the newspaper, and I come across a runaway slave advertisement. And I thought, okay, that's a little odd. This is a Philadelphia newspaper. The newspaper was dated 1796. Slavery was almost gone, right, in places like Philadelphia. So, like, who's advertising for a runaway? That's odd. So I kept reading. And the language kind of jumped out at me sort of immediately. It read something like, absconded from the household of the President of the United States. And I was like, whoa, wait a minute. So, I'm doing the math. That's George Washington. Okay. Who ran away from George Washington, and why is he advertising for this person in the newspaper as President of the United States? And I read further in the advertisement, and it named her. They named her Ona Judge. They called her Ona Judge. They described what she looked like, her age, and I thought, at that moment, I knew. Was fascinated. I thought, why don't I know this story? Here I am, supposedly an expert in early African-American women's history. I've never heard this name, Ona Judge, before. What happened to her? So my mind is sort of spinning, like I'm trying to finish up this first book, but I'm seeing what's becoming the second book, and that's what happens with historians, right? You find that project that you'll work on eventually while you're writing something else. And I thought, well, maybe I can find a way to bring this into book one. And I thought, no, I need to stop for a moment and really return to this. And I'm glad I did, because I finished the first book. And I couldn't help but think, well, two feelings. One, I was excited that no one had really been talking about this woman that they called Ona Judge. I thought, I have it, like here it is, and no one else is doing it. As historians, that's worth a lot. But on the other side, I also was angry and frustrated, and I was like, why am I just learning about this person? And so I vowed to sort of return to tell her story. It would lead me on a 9-year trail of uncovering the life of one of the most incredible women I've ever encountered in the archives. So I'll invite you to walk with me through the end of the 18th century. Spring rain drenched the streets of Philadelphia in 1796. Weather in the city of brotherly love was often fickle at this time of year, vacillating between extreme cold and oppressive heat. But rain was almost always appreciated in the nation's capital. It erased the putrid smells of rotting food, of animal waste, and filth that permeated the cobblestone roads of the new nation. Spring rain cleansed these streets and the souls of Philadelphians. It brought feelings of optimism and hope and a feeling of rebirth. And in the midst of the promises of spring, Ona Judge, a young enslaved woman, received devastating news. She learned that she was to leave Philadelphia, a city that had become her home. Judge was to travel back to her birthplace of Virginia and prepare herself to be given away as a wedding gift to her owner's granddaughter. Tonight I'll introduce one of the most understudied fugitive slaves in America. At the age of 22, Judge literally stole herself from the Washingtons, forcing the president to show his slave-catching hand. As a fugitive, Judge would test the president's will, his reputation. The most important man in the nation, heralded with winning the American Revolution, could not seem to reclaim his enslaved woman. Ona Judge did what very few other people had done before. She beat the president. Judge was never caught. And so I always sort of break at this moment to talk a little bit about the title. I always worked with the title, Never Caught, over the 9 years I was researching and writing the book. And so when I finished up the manuscript and my editor liked it and I was happy when I turned it in, I was sort of feeling like, okay, here's Easy Street, I'm done. And then I got the phone call, you know, the communication from marketing. And they said, we hate your title. And I was like, what do you mean you hate the title? I've been working with this title for 9 years. And they're like, Erica, you're giving away the story. And, you know, they had suggestions about what I could use. I kind of didn't really listen to many of them. But at that moment, I said, well, okay, well, we have other examples of narratives, of plays, of books where they're similar sort of titles. 12 Years a Slave. He's going to be a slave 12 years. At the end of 12 years, something's going to happen. We don't know what, but he won't be a slave anymore. Death of the salesman, you know how that's going to shake out, right? So we have examples where that's worked. But the reality is they wanted me to use, to figure out a way to use free or freedom, you know, in the title. And I said, no, I won't do that. Because in actuality, Ona Judge was never free. She was simply never caught. She would live nearly 50 years, half a century, as a fugitive. And I felt to use the title of free or freedom for the title of the book would be misleading. So I won that battle. You know, they did the Washington's Relentless Pursuit, and I'll sort of talk about the importance of that as well. I always, when I'm teaching with my undergrads, I always show images because, you know, I try to keep them awake. And here, you know, I'm sure many of you have been to Mount Vernon. This is a later image from 1872. Some of the earlier ones are not a little more sort of grainy. But I always think it's important to know, to have a visual of where your subject lived, right? So this is the back of the mansion house of George and Martha Washington's Mount Vernon. So if you're standing on this porch, how many of you have been to Mount Vernon here? Yep, good number. If you're standing on the back of this porch, you look out, and it's this sort of lovely view of the Potomac River. And this was the place in which Ona was born and spent her early years. I introduce a new American hero. An enslaved girl who was raised at Mount Vernon, who once exposed to the ideals of freedom, was compelled to pursue it at any cost. This was a woman who found the courage to defy the president, the wit to find allies, the strength to negotiate, to run, and to survive. Her story is the only account we have of a fugitive once held by the Washingtons. And we also believe that it might be the only account we have of a fugitive from 18th century Virginia. Judge's life exposes the sting of slavery and the drive of defiance. She guarded what she would later on call her freedom every day of her life, never regretting her decision to fight for what she believed to be her right, and that was the right to live as a free person. So Ona's born at Mount Vernon sometime in 1773-74. We don't have an exact date. The Washingtons did not record the birth dates of the enslaved. Technically, Ona Judge belonged to Martha Washington. So, sort of crash course, American history, Martha Washington was married prior to marrying George Washington, right? She was married and widowed. She had numerous children with her first husband, and when her husband died, it left her a very wealthy widow. She was one of the wealthiest women in the Chesapeake. And so when George Washington married her, as my grandmother would say, he married up, right? He married into a wealth that he did not have. And that wealth, a large portion of that, consisted of enslaved people. Right? So when Martha comes to Mount Vernon, when they marry, she brings with her tens of enslaved people, over 100, and one of those enslaved people was a woman named Betty. Betty was Ona's mother. Betty was a seamstress and a spinner, a pretty good one. She brought her young son, who was a toddler, by the name of Austin, with her. And Betty, as I said, as a seamstress and spinner, went about her days sort of doing the kind of domestic work also that was required of enslaved people. So Betty was Ona's mother. Andrew Judge was Ona's father. Andrew Judge was a white indentured servant. And Washington had purchased, I have a copy of his indenture agreement. Washington actually purchased his agreement from Baltimore. And Andrew Judge was a tailor. He made some of the sort of well-known outfits that Washington wore while in battle during the Revolution. I don't know the nature of the relationship or whatever it was between he and Betty. I don't know if it was consensual. I don't know if it was the opposite of that. What I do know is that sometime in 1773-74, Ona Judge was born. The records call her Oni Judge. Now there's no, Oni I argue is the diminutive of her name, like little Bobby, Billy, or Timmy, she's Oni. There's of course no record of birth or anything that has mother and father's name written on it. But what I do know is that there was no one else at Mount Vernon with the last name of Judge except for Andrew Judge. Actually, there was no one in the entire area of Fairfax, Virginia with the last name of Judge. So do I have a document that says Ona Judge is Andrew Judge's daughter? No. But I do know that he was a tailor, mother was a seamstress. She's described as a mixed race person later on. And she's one of the very few enslaved at Mount Vernon who are given a surname, a last name. So, and that's recognized by the Washingtons. At the age of 10, Ona was brought up to the mansion house to work for the Washingtons. She was to learn to become a seamstress and a spinner like her mother, which she did very well. And at some point, during her kind of what we call early teenage years now, she becomes sort of Martha Washington's chosen slave. I don't have a better phrase or title for that, but that's her preferred slave. It meant that she was responsible for the most intimate of chores and duties with Martha Washington. It meant she helped her bathe. It meant she brushed her hair. It meant she was on call constantly, 24/7, for Martha Washington. And it was this position, this liking that Martha Washington took to Ona that would change Ona's life. So when Washington was elected president in 1789, the Washingtons would move to New York. They decided that they would bring a little bit of home with them, and they would bring 7 enslaved people to New York. 5 men, 2 women. Ona Judge was one of them. So it's at this moment in 1789 that Ona's life changes. I'm going to read briefly from the book about this moment and what it meant for Ona and the others who were at Mount Vernon. The young Ona Judge was far from an experienced traveler. The teenager knew only Mount Vernon and its surroundings, and had never traveled far from her family and loved ones. For Judge, the move must have been similar to the dreaded auction block. Although she was not to be sold to a different owner, she was forced to leave her family for an unfamiliar destination hundreds of miles away. Judge would have no choice but to stifle the terror she felt and to go on about the work of preparing to move, folding linens, packing Martha Washington's dresses and personal accessories, helping with the grandchildren or the tasks at hand. And it wasn't her place to complain or question. Judge had to remain strong and steady, if not for herself, then for her mistress, who appeared to be falling apart at the seams. Like Judge, Martha Washington had no choice about the move to New York. Her life was at the direction of her husband, who was now the most powerful man in the country. Mrs. Washington and Ona Judge may have shared similar concerns, but of course only Martha Washington was allowed to express discontent and sorrow. Martha Washington was unhappy, and everyone knew it, including her frightened slave. The president's nephew, Robert Lewis, would also soon be made aware of it. When he arrived at the estate on May 14th, things were in disarray. Lewis, who served as Washington's secretary between 1789 and 91, was chosen to escort his aunt and her grandchildren to New York, but was surprised and a bit concerned when he arrived to find a frenzied and hectic scene. Lewis wrote, "Everything appeared to be in confusion," the manifestation of Mrs. Washington's conflicting feelings. Robert Lewis described the departure, which finally took place on May 16, 1789, as an emotional moment for the enslaved and the First Lady. He wrote, quote, "After an early dinner, making all necessary arrangements, in which we were greatly retarded, it brought us to 3 o'clock in the afternoon when we left Mount V. The servants of the house and a number of the field Negroes made their appearance to take leave of their mistress. Numbers of these poor wretches seemed greatly agitated, much affected. My aunt equally so." End quote. Betty, Ona Judge's mother, must have been one of those agitated slaves. Not only was she losing her 16-year-old daughter, but she was also losing her son, Austin, who would serve as one of the Washington's waiters. Austin's wife, Charlotte, and their children would join in the morning. Betty watched her children leave Mount Vernon, a reminder of what little control enslaved mothers had over the lives of their children. If she found any comfort that day, it would have been that brother and sister were traveling together. Austin was older and male and could look out for his younger sister. But still, Betty knew that her relationship with her children would never be the same. And so this is the moment that Ona, as a 16 or so year old, has her family torn away from her. When this is an image of Federal Hall on Wall Street, which is where the library would have been close to it. I always show this image to my students because I want them to sort of know sort of where, Washington would have taken the oath inside. He would have come out on the balcony and given his speech. And he did all of this alone. Martha Washington wasn't there yet. She was dragging her feet and trying to come. She didn't want to move. We've heard this recently with First Family. So in 1789, when they move, they actually only stay in New York a sort of brief period of time. And this is the moment where I'm appreciative of Lin-Manuel Miranda and Hamilton, because now my students come, they know a little something now about the early republic, and they know that the nation's capital was in New York and eventually moved to Philadelphia, so he's made my job easier. I thank him for that. So eventually they move to Philadelphia in November of 1790. This is a lithograph from much later, from the 1830s or so, of what was called the President's House, or the Executive Mansion, in Philadelphia. And I always show this to my students because I want them to see what a president's house looked like in the 18th century, right? It's not a White House or a Mar-a-Lago or wherever presidents live these days, right? It is, by our standards, a relatively modest-looking home. For their standards, it was a large home with 3 stories, but this home was packed to the gills. Almost 30 people lived in this home. So the Washingtons decide when they come to Philadelphia that they would actually bring 9 enslaved people this time. So the number moves up. But there are also a host of servants who are live-in. There are secretaries. There are families of the secretaries for Washington who are living in this house. So the quarters are tight. I want students to understand that there was a complete lack of privacy for everybody living in this house, including Ona, including the Washingtons. Their move to Philadelphia proved to be slightly problematic when it came to slavery. When they arrived in Philadelphia, slavery was almost gone. There are about 100 enslaved people, or roughly, by 1790 in Philadelphia. There are over 6,000 free blacks living there, right? So when the Washingtons come, Ona is the oddball, right? She's not the norm. And they quickly realized that what was permissible and accepted in New York, slavery was still very much entrenched in New York. There was something very different happening in Philadelphia, in part because of Quaker presence and legislation. But there had, the Washingtons sort of have to deal with this fairly quickly. George goes off for a southern tour, and Martha's home alone, as she often was. And she was paid a visit by the Attorney General, who knocks on the door and says, I need basically to talk to your husband. He's not there. I need to talk to you. And he basically says, you have a problem. The law in Pennsylvania, in 1780, there was a Gradual Emancipation Act that was passed. And as a part of this law, it stated that if you were a non-resident and you came and you moved to Philadelphia, if you stayed, and you brought your slaves, if you stayed for longer than 6 months, then your slaves could be set free. And the Attorney General says, well, and the reason I know this is problematic for us, because originally the Washingtons, the Attorney General, people believed that they were exempt from this law because members of Congress were. They weren't members of Congress. The Attorney General comes to the Washingtons and says, look, the reason I know that is because my slaves just confronted me with this, which I find hilarious. They are telling the Attorney General the law, right? I'm citing every law. And they're free. And I know you have enslaved people living here. This is a problem that you might need to address. So Tobias Lear, George Washington's secretary, writes to him. I'm reading the letters. And he writes and he says, we have this problem. He explains, I need your advice. What should we do? And George Washington writes back that basically they were going to, and I paraphrase, but that they wanted, he would create a slave rotation plan. And every 6 months, George Washington would rotate his slaves out of Philadelphia back to Virginia. And if that was too problematic, a quick trip to Trenton would basically restart the clock on slavery. Right, so this is a moment where I'm reading these letters and I'm like, George, like, what are you doing? You know, clearly I'm reading this and saying, thinking about the opportunity to have had free laborers in his home, to have had servants who would expect a daily wage, but that couldn't have happened. He and Martha chose to have and to keep enslaved laborers with them because that's what they wanted. That's what felt good. And Washington wrote this. He said he did not like white servants. He said they were lazy. This is what Washington said. You know, that there were all kinds of problems. He didn't like the way they kept the kitchen. He had issues with these northern white servants. And he brought his slaves with him. And so for the next 6 years, Ona Judge and her other enslaved companions would be rotated constantly out of Philadelphia back to it. And even that technically was breaking the law because there was an amendment to the law. So I'm reading this like, okay, they didn't know the law too well. And because the amendment says you can't do that, right? The whole point in Pennsylvania was to end slavery and to not allow outsiders as well to bring them. So this would be what the Washingtons did out of this house for the next 6 years. Until February of 1796. There was a palpable unease in the executive mansion. The Washingtons received a letter from their granddaughter, Eliza Parke Custis, who would become Parke Custis Law. There's a kind of folktale about this image. She was sort of known for being a difficult, kind of rash child and then woman. Supposedly Gilbert Stuart painted this image, this portrait. He was in the middle of finishing a portrait on Washington, and she was annoyed that things were taking so long, and so she bursts in the door and she has her arms crossed, and so he decides to paint her because he thinks that she's interested, right? And so this is one of Martha Washington's grandchildren. What's important to note is that Martha Washington has a number of children with her first husband, all of whom die before they are really adults. She has one adult son who dies in the Revolution of Camp Fever, Eliza's father. So when the Washingtons become the first family, she brings 2 of her grandchildren to live with them, to basically care for them. And Eliza was not one of them. She was older. She remained in Virginia. But she wrote to the Washingtons in February saying, I'm going to get married, and you don't know him. And he's 20 years older than I am, and he's a British man, and he spent a considerable amount of time in India. She didn't write that he had 3 mixed-race children from an Indian woman. He was a total wild card for the Washingtons, and she's basically writing to them asking for permission to marry. Her father is deceased. She looks to George Washington, to her grandfather, as someone who would approve. And the Washingtons are upset about this, but eventually they make a decision. They decide that Washington writes, I'm reading these letters back and forth between Eliza and George Washington, and eventually he says, yes, we approve of your marriage. They don't go to the wedding, but they say, this is what you want, we will sign off. They marry on March 21st, 1796, and the marriage signaled the beginning of major changes for the Washingtons and for their slaves. At this moment, Martha Washington made a decision. Her deep concern for her granddaughter trumped any relationship that she had forged with anyone else. She felt as though Eliza was unprepared for marriage, that she was rash, that she was difficult, and that she needed support that Martha Washington could not give. She wasn't there. So what she would do is give her her very best slave. That would be Ona Judge. Ona leaves behind 2 interviews at the end of her life, telling us that she knew she was to be given away to Eliza. She thought that it would happen immediately. not after the death of her owners, as some had suggested. But she makes a statement, and she says she was determined never to be her slave. And because of that, she turns to the free black community of Philadelphia that helped her plan an escape. On May 21st, 1796, Ona Judge escapes from the president's house and never returns. This is one of the advertisements that the Washingtons place in the newspaper in 1796. So there's one in the Philadelphia Gazette, which was the first one I read, and then Claypool's American Daily Advertiser. And in Ona's interviews at the end of her life, she says, quote, "Whilst they were packing to go to Virginia, I was packing to go, I didn't know where. For I knew that if I went back to Virginia, I should never get my liberty. I had friends among the colored people of Philadelphia, had my things carried there beforehand, and left the Washingtons' house while they were eating dinner." End quote. A few days, this is a Saturday, by Monday the Washingtons are advertising for her. They advertise for her for a week. I found one thing very interesting, the last paragraph. $10 will be paid to any person, white or black, who will bring her home if taken in the city. They know that she's been helped by the free black community, and they're looking to the free black community, hopefully, to get some information about her. Ona Judge would leave in May of 1796 and would never return. She left in May. By August, the Washingtons knew where she was. She had been reported upon. Ona found her way to New England, to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And I don't want to, I mean, you all know she was never caught, but I don't want to spoil, I don't want to do the spoiler thing because I do when, I am selling books outside afterwards. But what I will say is that the Washingtons would pursue Ona until the end of their lives. That George Washington would lean on federally appointed officials, the Secretary of the Treasury, customs collectors, family members, all to pursue her while he was president and while he was a citizen. Washington would die in December of 1799, and I have correspondence as late as September of that year where he's still pursuing her. I won't tell you how she manages to evade the Washingtons, but what I'll tell you is this. Ona would live basically in an isolated area in New Hampshire for nearly half a century. For 50 years, even after the Washingtons die, she knows that she is not safe, that technically she would be passed down to the heirs of Martha Washington, as were all of the enslaved at Mount Vernon who belonged to Martha Washington. She knew that even though they were gone, she was not free. And so what I find so incredible about her was that she managed to stay detached from the Washingtons, that she lived this life for half a century, choosing this existence over anything else. So in closing, what I'll say is that while Ona lived in the shadows for nearly half a century, I know that she never wanted to be forgotten. And so writing this book has been both an obligation and an honor. And I thank you all for listening. Time for some Q&A if folks have questions or comments or thoughts they'd like to share. Go ahead, yes.
It's been a long time since I've had an American history class, but I've always heard that Washington manumitted his slaves in his will.
Yeah.
And we know, of course, they were all Martha's slaves. They weren't his, and so he manumitted them on her death. I don't know what year she died, but wouldn't that impact on them?
Yeah, so that's a great, you remember well. So one of the things, when we think about the way historians, or the way we remember founding fathers in particular in slavery, we remember and know that George Washington did make the decision to emancipate his slaves upon the death of Martha. So remember, he did not have or own as many slaves as did Martha. And he made this decision basically, and for many reasons, I think Washington's kind of got the pass on slavery for a while, because he knew, and he talked about, I think, and what I try to show in the book is that he changes also, like his feelings and opinions about slavery changes over time. He's just as affected by living in the North and fighting in the Revolution and sort of what this nation should be. And he is friends with the Marquis de Lafayette, who's like, George, what are you doing with the slavery thing? Like, that's just crazy. And so there are moments where George Washington writes, I wish to get quit of my Negroes. He wants to end, but he always finds a reason not to, right? Like, oh, they're intermarried with Martha's slaves, and that would tear families apart. I can't do that, right? And so he makes this decision to emancipate them upon Martha's death. So what happens is that George dies in December of 1799. And Martha realizes that the only thing preventing over 120 people from having slavery is her life, right? And she gets nervous. Rightfully so. She writes to Abigail Adams and others. She's, there are these suspicious fires on Mount Vernon. She's thinking that these slaves are plotting on her. They might have been, right? Because they knew that once she was gone, freedom would come. So she preempts that. She doesn't want to sleep with one eye open for the rest of her life, and she emancipates them before she dies. So she does an early emancipation, but they're emancipated in January of 1801, so almost a year later. And then Martha dies in 1802. So I tracked all of the enslaved at Mount Vernon after the deaths of Martha and George. All of Martha's slaves were sent to her grandchildren. They were all still enslaved. She set no one free. There's some who believe that according to estate law, she didn't have the ability to emancipate, to change the will, but she changed George's. But, she said, and Martha actually purchased at least one slave of her own that was not inherited from her first husband, and she didn't set him free either. So I tracked them. They all went to her remaining grandkids, around 4 of them that were in Virginia. Those people who remained enslaved were Ona's kin. Ona left behind siblings at Mount Vernon. I tracked them. I know who owned them. I know where they went. The majority of them actually went to Martha Washington's grandson, George Washington Parke Custis, who, follow me here, George Washington Parke Custis builds an estate that we all know now as Arlington Cemetery, right? He would marry, his slaves were there. His daughter would eventually marry a guy named, that we all know as General Lee. So Ona's relatives remain, most of them, not all, some of them remain enslaved. So George's death and his will had no impact upon her. And one thing that I think is really important for us, we'd say, okay, well, George, at least he did the right thing in death. Like, he wouldn't do it while he was living. But when he died, he made the decision. But, I trouble that. I interrogate that, and I say, George Washington had no biological children. He and Martha Washington did not have children. And as far as we know, George Washington didn't have any others. So he did not have the expectation of passing down wealth that came in the form of human bodies to any son or any daughter. Yeah, there were cousins and nephews and what have you that were there ready to cash in. But without that expectation of passing on wealth to children, I think that freed Washington to do maybe what he had been wrestling with for so many years.
I'm clear, so you say that Martha did not?
Martha didn't set anybody free. So their estate remained separate. The entirety of their marriage, the slaves that she brought to Mount Vernon from her first marriage, if you look at the slave census that they keep at Mount Vernon, it says dower slaves. Those are Martha's slaves. And then it has George Washington slaves on another side of the page.
But you said that the year before she died, she was worried that they...
Those were George Washington slaves. So George had made the decision to set his slaves free upon the death of Martha.
So she said,
I'm going to do that quickly.
She allowed them their freedom.
Yes, but not hers.
But not hers ever.
No, never.
A two-part question. One, just you mentioned dower slave.
Yeah.
I had read that Martha could not legally give up the slave or free the slave because under the law, the slave would pass to her relatives.
Mm-hmm.
And then more generally, do you believe that it's reasonable to judge the Washingtons by the standards of their time, or would you judge them by, say, today's standards?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. The first question about the legality of emancipation is a good one. There's some scholars who argue that because, not so much that they were a part of an estate, but more that because Martha Washington's first husband died without a will, that made things sort of murky. And that she would not have been able to amend anything regarding inheritance. But she does amend George Washington's will. And like I said before, she has at least one slave that she's purchased outright that did not come, and probably more than one, that did not come from her first husband. She does not set that person free either. And she also writes, it's very clear just to watch, it's sort of a study in contrasts. When you look at George Washington and Martha Washington, you read kind of what they wrote and thought about enslaved people. George Washington, we know from his writings, was uncomfortable, at least towards the end of his life, with slavery, and made a decision to change that. Martha never suggested anything of the sort. It was actually sort of the opposite in much of the writing that she did leave behind. Martha Washington burned all of the correspondence between her and her husband because she knew that nosy people like me would be looking for stuff later. I can't blame her. There are a couple of letters that are in existence between the two of them, so we have very little in the way of evidence to interrogate their relationship and their feelings about slavery or writing about it to each other. The question about is it fair to judge the Washingtons, you know, I think that we can take a step back and look at some of the other people who we call founding fathers and their attitudes and feelings of slavery. Ben Franklin was a slave owner, and then he wasn't. Ben Franklin held slaves and eventually changed his mind about that while he was alive, emancipated his slaves, and then became an abolitionist, right? Being the sort of president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. I think maybe the question is it fair to judge them? I think it's maybe a more useful or helpful question to ask, why shouldn't we interrogate them and their attitudes about slavery and race the same way we do with other founding fathers, with other people? And there were others at that time. Founding father, but clearly the next president did not own slaves, right? Adams did not own slaves. Of course, he was a Northerner, and the Washingtons were Virginians. But I don't necessarily think, in terms of thinking about American history and having it be a story that is as accurate as possible. It'll always change. It'll always be different based upon interpretation of other people. But I don't think that it is helpful for us to not include the stories of the enslaved. At the moment that Washington died, there were over 300 enslaved people living at Mount Vernon. And I think we have to, there's a way to appreciate all that Washington did for this nation, to understand that he gave his life to service, to be president, to fight in the American Revolution. That was like 16, 17 years combined, you know, at a moment when people's lifespans are relatively short. That was a service. I think it helps us understand people better if we make certain their lives are nuanced and we can say, yes, he did this, and then there was this. And also because he writes about his misgivings regarding slavery. Eventually, of course, he makes that decision to emancipate them, but not while he was alive. And so what I try to do with Never Caught is to complicate everybody, right? To not make this a sort of two-dimensional story about George Washington, founding father, and Ona, poor slave. It wasn't that at all. It was a complicated set of relationships that, because of the institution of slavery, played out in different ways. So I'm of the belief that we, you know, I like to make things a little messy. Let's kind of get in there and see what's really happening. And I don't think that it denigrates the Washingtons at all. I think that we know that the majority of Virginians at that moment held slaves, right? And here we have an example of the first president and first lady, not a term that we don't use until later on, who are in some ways wrestling with this issue of slavery. I think it helps us understand better the nature of race relations in this country and the problem of race and slavery from the founding of the nation. And that's why I wrote, I'm going to go back to the beginning slide here. I call this the founding of the nation through the eyes of the enslaved, because I was interested in writing a story. I'm not a Washington biographer. I know a lot about it. But I focus on African American women. Their lives intersect. And what I wanted to do with this book was to tell not a sort of typical founding father story, top-down history, but to think about what this nation looked like through the eyes of the enslaved who built it. And it's the first, really, book to do that, to think about, and Ona's the perfect portal to do it, in part because she's mobile. She moves from Virginia to New York to Philadelphia, then to New Hampshire. That's like all of America at that point, right? She's in the South, it's Mid-Atlantic, it's New England. She becomes that, and she's with the Washingtons. So she becomes that sort of perfect portal to look at what's happening. It's not just her life or biographical, but we have a way to think about what the early republic felt like as an enslaved person. So I'm grateful that Ona gave us interviews at the end of her life. Can I take more questions? That's fine.
Maybe one more question? Or?
Well, you have to pick that person. I'm not doing it. You pick. I think you got picked. Yes.
About the advertisement you were showing
Sure.
for a little while. It's called Claypool.
American Daily Advertiser.
Can you
Yeah.
say?
Yeah.
Well, I'm interested in something. Slavery was becoming illegal in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
But that publication is a Pennsylvania publication.
It is.
So, there was no taboo about saying certain things in publications.
Some publication. That's a great point. That at the time, the major newspaper in Philadelphia was the Pennsylvania Gazette, which was written and published by Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin in 1796 was not publishing runaway slave advertisements because he was an abolitionist by then, right? He had already changed his feelings about slavery. So in the Pennsylvania Gazette, by 1796, we don't see runaway ads. But in some of these others, oh, that's her marriage announcement. I didn't get a chance to show you all that. I did a little dance when I found her marriage announcement when she moves, and you can see by January of 1790. I did want you all to know, because when you buy the book, figure out that she gets married. But you don't know what else happens. So, but that was a little sort of nerdy moment for me when I found in the archives her actual marriage announcement. But yeah, so their newspapers, moving back to the Claypool's American Daily Advertiser, that did still have runaway ads. Not a whole lot in Philadelphia. It changes. But if you go back 10 years, 15 years, all of the newspapers for the most part have runaway slave advertisements. But it starts to change, and that reflects the changing attitudes in Philadelphia and the acceptability of slavery.
Oh, so the press didn't want. And was Claypool's distributed in the region or?
Mostly in the southeast section of Pennsylvania, so Philadelphia and what we would say it's environs. And what's interesting though is they only run the advertisement for a week. That's like a really short time in the 18th century to run an advertisement. People, if you were looking for a runaway, you could advertise for months for this person, hoping that someone would see them. But after a week, they pull back the advertisement, and they decide, they make the decision that they're not going to do this through a sort of very public venue, that they're going to do it through word of mouth, through acquaintances, through the Secretary of the Treasury, through their sort of links of friends across the nation.
Were there slave catchers at that time?
Most certainly. There were slave catchers, and the reality is that George Washington conscripts the Secretary of the Treasury and collectors, customs collectors, and a nephew to be those slave catchers. But let's think about this. Also, this is a moment, like, in terms of, we would call it PR now, right? It's like a PR nightmare, because this is happening at a moment when George Washington has already decided to step down from office. And so he makes the decision that, legacy was important. And to chase after her at a moment when, the second presidential election was very contested with Adams, and he wanted to sort of focus on that, and he didn't really need to have stories about him going after an enslaved woman in Portsmouth, a place that was not necessarily super comfortable with slavery, and a place that where there wasn't a large black population to begin with, so let alone slaves. And so he made the decision to withdraw and to decide to handle this as a private citizen instead. So when he becomes a private citizen and goes back to Mount Vernon, he picks up where he leaves off. And he is still sending people for her. And so there's a set of letters, I'm not telling you anything else, there's a set of letters between him and others in New England, and that reveal his attempt. And every time he writes these letters, he's always like, because I'm asking myself, all right, why is he really going after her? Like, he's wrestling with this issue of slavery, the 300 slaves in Mount Vernon. What is it about Ona that he, and at first I was like, is this a Thomas Jefferson, Sally Hemings kind of thing, right? And at first I thought I knew that's what it was. I didn't find anything like that. Doesn't mean it didn't happen. I'm just saying I don't have evidence that suggests anything else. What we do know is that when he writes, he's angry with her. And he says, we treated her more like a child than a servant. And in every letter to whomever he's pulling into his web of slave catching, he says, my wife is desirous of seeing her again. My wife is really upset. So he's always kind of throwing it back on Martha. I believe that. I believe that Martha was very angry. They felt like they had treated her well, and she had disobeyed them and was not loyal. And the moment where I thought, well, maybe it wasn't so personal, but I'll tell you a little bit. So she's still left with this issue, Martha Washington is, who's gonna go help Eliza? Because Eliza's like a live wire and marrying this dude who she doesn't know, and Martha knew it was a bad situation. I mean, actually, after Martha dies, they divorce, right? So she was right about what was gonna happen. So she's still left without someone to go and calm Eliza and assist her. So Martha makes a decision, over 300 enslaved people. She makes a decision to send Ona's sister in her stead. So the job that Ona would not do, her sister was forced to do. And that's a morale, okay, that was personal. Like, that was just kind of cold-blooded. Like, there are all these people that you could choose from, and you choose her sister? Okay, maybe it's a coincidence, but I tell that story as well in the book, because I want to sort of show two women then, who at this moment in 1796 are trying to find a way to become free. Ona's done it, of course, by running away. And her sister, whose name was Philadelphia, is doing it through a different set of circumstances with Eliza Park Custis Long.
Probably should sign.
I know.
Thank you so